Hi everyone, welcome to another AnyDB video tutorial. Previously in part 1 and part 2, we showed you how to build an invoicing system inside AnyDB. And in this tutorial today, we're going to extend that to support an invoice with an unlimited set of line items. What do I mean by that? So if we go back to our system, we had an invoice dashboard with a number of invoices. If I open up one of the invoices, we can see that this invoice actually has 4 line items. Now, your business might be okay with just having 4 line items, might not have more than that, but many companies do have invoices within a lot of invoice line items. And how do you manage that? Because let's say you started having 20 line items. Will you modify the template? So let's take a quick look. Now, if we look at our template, by clicking on Edit Template, we see that we have 4 entries for the line items, and that works, of course, as we saw. But if you have 20 line items, you have to extend this template and add 20 lines, and that could still work. But what happens if you have to invoice somebody 25 line items? Your invoice just wouldn't work, and that doesn't scale well. So today, we're going to actually replace these line items with an ability to add an unlimited set of line items, and that's going to be the topic for today's tutorial. So to do that, if you remember, our previous invoicing structure looked like something like this. You had your company address, the customer details, the invoice details, and then the line items, which were fixed to only 4 items. What we're going to do is to replace that with a structure that looks like something like this. So instead of having a fixed set of line items, we're going to have invoice line items as a separate record inside AnyDB. And then using AnyDB's attachment functionality, we can attach any number of invoice line items to this invoice, and then we could still have them show up in the invoice as well as show up with the total on the invoice. Now, how does this invoice line item look like? Well, the invoice line item is a very simple entry or record. It has a name or the product name or the service that you're selling, the price, a code of that particular product, the quantity, and then a total. Now, how are we going to do this? We're going to use a similar structure like before, where when we had our individual line items, we could select the product for the name. And once we selected the product, we would automatically fill in the data of the price from the cell D2 inside entry. And now we're also going to fill in the data from the product record for the cell D3. The quantity you have to enter in your invoice, the total will be calculated automatically. Once you have an invoice line item record like this, it's going to be very simple to extend your invoicing system. So let's begin. All right. To begin creating a new invoice line item record, we're going to click on New, select Template. We're going to select a build or edit our own, and then select New Template. And in the designer, we want to build the same thing that we used to have in our invoice, which is as a line item. So we're going to select and type in the 4 fields. Let's go back to our whiteboard. And the fields we're going to have are the name, the price, the code, the quantity, and the total. So if we go back to our template, let's go ahead and try to create those items right here. So first we want to be able to select the product. So I'm going to select the product and then select the type as reference. And you want to restrict this to only product items. Next, we want to be able to select the name of the product. And then we want to be able to select the price of the product and the code. And of course, we should be able to type in the quantity. And finally, the total. Now the total is going to be the multiplication of C1 times E1. So let's just do C1 times E1. And now we will check every other field. So the product is going to be a reference. As soon as we select a reference, we want the name to be selected from the product, and that's going to be A2. And we can use the same method we used before, which is going to be a dynamic reference from A1, and the name field is in A2 inside the product record. So we're going to pick that. And if you are ever wanting to be sure what we are doing, you can check your product record, open it up, and see which fields are where. Now the price is in D2, so it's going to be a dynamic reference again of A1, and then we're going to say D2, and then the code is going to be a dynamic reference of, again, A1, and code is going to be D3. And we can always double check this really quickly by selecting a product, and you can see it fills up perfectly, and that's exactly what you want. So you want to remove it by clicking on the product and clicking on delete button. That'll remove the selection, and none of this is selected. The quantity is going to be a number, so let's select a number. The total is going to be a currency, so let's select currency. And the price is also going to be a currency, so I'll select currency. I think that's fine. And then the code is going to be general. That's good, and the name is also general, which is fine. Now we want the name of the template of the record that is created to be automatically generated from the product. So we're going to make this dynamic. So select that, hit equals, and then we're going to do a formula, and it's going to be a very simple formula. I'm going to just concatenate the type of record, and it's going to be saying invoice line item, and put a dash, and we're going to add if. We only want to set this if the line item entry selects a product. So we're going to pick the record cell B1. So if B1, we want to use B1, otherwise we're going to say not set. Now this is completely optional. You don't have to do it, but I'm just trying to make that look good. So with that, let's go ahead and save the template. Let's call this invoice line item. Let's set up a record. And let's pick something like here. And let's select the background real quick. Call it invoice line item. All right, now we go ahead and save it. All right, now that we have our invoice line item, let's go ahead and replace our invoices to use the new invoice line items. So to modify the template, go to our database, click on the three dots over here and click on Manage Data Templates, and select the ABC invoice that we created before. You're going to click on Edit Template. Now, once we open the template, what we want to do is replace this section with attachments that allow any number of invoice line items. So how do we do that? Well, first let's go and remove these cells. You can select all of these cells and click on Shift Delete, which will delete all of these cells in one shot. Now we want this to become an attachment cell. So we can use the space by selecting all of them, clicking on Merge, which makes this a single cell. Now go ahead and change the format to become an attachments, and then select the template type to be the invoice line item. Now, once you select that, let's also select the columns. To select the columns, click on here, and then first select the name, and then we want to select the code. Let's select the price, the quantity, and then the total. Now, we can also select the index if you want to show the number of items. So let's click on Apply. Now, with that, we're going to have a bunch of invoices that are being added to this particular invoice. I'm sorry, the number of invoice line items to be added to this particular invoice. Now, what has to change is this total, because previously we were counting the cells, summing the cells E8 to E11, but they don't exist anymore. These total has to come from all the invoice line item total entries. And how do we do that? Well, let's go ahead and remove this and change this formula to not be the local cells from the child attachment cells. And to do that, we simply say C at current record, and then we're going to select n@, which is going to be the name of the type of record type we have, which is going to be inv line item. And then we're going to have another type, which is going to be the cell from where we're going to get the total. Now, the invoice line item, the total was F1. So I'm going to type in F1 and press enter. And because there's no entries, it's going to show there's no items there, and that's what's currently happening. If you don't want to show this bad error, we can always put this by another formula in Excel. We can have if error, we can have this as 0. Now that will show a much better value. Now let's go ahead and save this and see what happens. So I'm going to save the template. Let's call this ABC invoice. We're going to migrate the 5 existing records. Let's go ahead and do that. Now in this, because we've deleted all these cells, it's telling us what has been deleted and what has been modified. And we're going to say accept that, because when we do this migration, we're going to lose some data in the previous invoices. So let's go ahead and migrate, and that should take a little bit of time for the migration to complete. Now let's just real quickly, let's go ahead and create a new invoice. Click on record. We're going to select the ABC invoice over here. And as soon as we do that, now we can see the cells here has been replaced with this particular attachment cell. And you can see invoice line items. First, let's go ahead and select customer. So let's go ahead and select the customer. Let's put the invoice date, unpaid. Now let's go ahead and add an invoice line item. So I'm going to click on an invoice line item. In this line item, I'm going to select the coffee, and you can see as soon as I do that, it fills it all up. Let's pick up 10 of them, and I'm going to see my total automatically calculate. If I go back to my invoice right now, you can see that it's filled in the data, and you can see the total also filled up. Now let's go ahead and add a few more items right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and add one more. So I'm going to say this is going to be the wall clock, and we're going to say 2. And we can do this also by adding another invoice line item right here without having to close and reopen, which can be a little tougher. Let's select the gift set as well, and this is going to be 1. And finally, we're going to create another one by selecting, let's say, the desk lamp, and we're going to have 20 of them. And now if you go back to the invoice, you can see that we now have 4 line items, and then the total has been added to this one. Overall, I actually missed real quick here the quantity, so I'm going to add this back. Let's go back here, and you can see it's updated. So now my invoice total is 2,991, but then there's no limit to the number of records or invoices that I could actually add here. And this is how you can now support adding any number of invoice line items to your invoice. And this is very flexible. It's very scalable. You can have hundreds of items. And here's the power of the system. AnyDB really allows you to combine multiple records together to form a compound record. And that allows really, really powerful ways of expressing and managing and modeling your data. Now, before we finish up, there's one thing I want to talk a little bit more. That is the formula that we use to calculate the total from the invoice line item records that have been attached to this particular invoice. Now, the way this works is the invoice line items have been attached to this invoice. So if you go to the attachments tab over here, you can actually see the invoice line items. There are 4 of them that have been attached. So what you're seeing in over here is just a shortcut to all these attachments to this particular record. Now, let's go ahead and look at the formula that we used, because that might look like magic. But if I click on the total over here, there is this big formula which is over here, the sum of something, and that's computing the data. So how does that work? So if we go back to our whiteboard, this is the formula we used. It looks like sum of C at this big section, followed by something else, and followed by something else. The structure that we use is essentially 3 parts. And these parts are separated by this exclamation mark, which is a separator between these separate sections. The sum is basically saying that we want to add the data from cells of the attachments of this record. And we want to get the values from the cell F1 because the invoice line items have the total as F1. So we want to get the sum of all of these values of F1. But if you just say sum of F1, that's not enough because we want to say it's the child items of this record of invoice line item types, and we want to get the F1 of that. So this section, these two, are basically referring to what and what specifically do we want to get the values from. So the first section is basically, you can imagine as when you say C at, that just means children of. So you can think of it as here that we're referring to this as children are attachments of. And what exactly are we attaching to? Well, we want to specify of which record. And current rec, CURRREC, is a special way to refer to the current record. And then we want to say, well, we got all the attachments, but you could have a lot of different attachments to a record. It might be invoice line items, you might have files, you might have codes or so on, purchase orders and so on. In this case, we want to specifically pick the invoice line items. So we say, hey, we want to select the ones with the name at and then the name of the template. And that's why we say name at invoice line item and finally the cell. So that's F1. So this formula basically says, give me the sum of all of my attachments of this current record, because we could have got the attachments of another record, but in this case, we want to get the attachments of whatever record we are running the formula for, which is going to be this current record. And then don't get me all attachments, get me only attachments of this particular type of record, which is going to have the name, invoice line item, and get me the value F1. And that's how this formula actually works and gets you the values that you see here. Now, in future tutorials, we will visit and talk about exactly how formulas work. With this, I'm going to stop this tutorial and thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.